Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, we're back with another top 10 player list for Survivor. And as a spin-off to my top 10 players of all time, I decided to do here my top 10 non-winning players of all time. Obviously the people that have never won the game. And this is obviously radically different from my top 10 player of all time list because a lot of the people that made the top 10 on that list were winners. So this is a very different list from the top 10 player list. So I still have the same criteria for the ranking here. I mean, a lot of the way I assess players is who I think has the most potential to win the game and actively get themselves to the end of the game if you were to run a random season over and over and over again. Now I do have a good chunk of honorable mentions, so let's just jump right into those. Now we might as well go through them in the order that they originally played. So the first honorable mention here is Lex. I think Lex is one of the first people to really dominate his season of Survivor. He pretty much controlled that game from beginning to end and really ends up losing the game solely due to an immunity run. And I think even on All-Stars he showed that again. He was able to dominate his initial tribe until the merge, but I do think he has some faulty logic at points. I do think he gets a bit too hot-headed at points. And I don't think he's a person that would adapt to the modern game of Survivor super well, so I didn't put him on my list. I also considered Cathy O'Brien, and she was much closer to making the list. I think Cathy is someone that showed the ability at the time of Survivor Marquesas to play a more fluid game. I mean, she was willing to flip on the row 2-4 at the final 9, and then later on thought about teaming up with the General at the final 6 to make a new majority there. At the final 4, when she was clearly in danger, she was able to pick up the Sepia and go to Rocks. Like, I do think there are things that are very impressive about her game. And then we see her in All-Stars do just as well, really bonding with a lot of people, and does become a big target by the time the merge after her tribe comes in without the numbers. But I do think Cathy is a great player of Survivor, but she's another one that's kind of harmed by the fact that she hasn't played in a modern season. I don't know how well she would adapt to the modern climate of Survivor. I don't know how much her mindset has changed on the game of Survivor, because a lot of these old school players don't seem to adapt to the really cutthroat game that Survivor is now. And I just don't know if Cathy would be able to adapt that much. So because that she didn't make my list, I did consider Johnny Fairplay. Because I mean, Fairplay, like, say what you will about him. I mean, he played a fantastic game in Pro Islands. I think he played one of the most dynamic games we've seen up to that point. I mean, obviously he took inspiration from Rob Cesternino, but I think he further evolved that strategy. The problem I have with Fairplay, though, isn't the cutthroat nature that I feel like Lex and Cathy might lack. I think Fairplay definitely has that. I think the problem with Fairplay is just I don't feel like he is poised well in every scenario. I mean, mind you, it is impressive how he was able to get into the majority in Micronesia before he decided to quit. I just feel like Fairplay's the type of person that gets on the wrong side of people a lot. He's the type of person that I feel like has a tough time winning a jury vote. I feel like even on Pro Islands, I mean, I do think there are scenarios that he wins on that season, but I think he definitely loses against like Sandra, probably Dara. I mean, I think there's people he definitely loses against, and Fairplay is just too polarizing of a personality even out there that I feel like he has a tough time winning any given season. So because of that, he did miss the list for me as well. I did consider Ozzy, but not really. I considered him just because, again, he is obviously a legendary figure within Survivor. Made it to the final 2 his first time, won a whole bunch of challenges to get to the end. Micronesia was a dominant force in the game, though became too dominant of a force and became blindside early on. South Pacific, again, another one where he won a lot of challenges and when it was able to get to the end of the game through winning through Redemption Island. And then Game Changers, he did pretty much nothing. Not much there. But I think Ozzy has the ability to make it far into the game on most seasons. Like, I don't think there's a chance Ozzy goes home early pre-merge ever. Like, I think the only time he gets taken out pre-merge is at the point where they're worried he's going to win out once he gets to the merge. And they might snipe him out right before that, but I think the good thing about Ozzy is that he's not looked at as a strategic mastermind. He's not like a player we'll be talking about a bit later. That I think there's more opportunities for that person to go home earlier because they're looked at as a better all-around player. I feel like with Ozzy, people look at him just as a physical player. I don't feel like they look at him as a good social or strategic player. And to be honest, that might be to his benefit, but I still think he's a player that's always going to be reliant on winning out. And if he can't win out, I think he's gone at the first opportunity. And for me, that's not a very reliable way of playing the game. So because because I didn't put Ozzy too high on the list either. I considered Yaman. Yaman is someone that was a very innovative player. During Survivor Fiji, I mean, the first season with the modern hidden immunity idol, I mean, Yaman knew how to play the idol. I think he knew how to utilize that to the best of his ability, create a fake idol. He was able to sniff out when the votes were going towards him and play it correctly. He was part of the majority for a good chunk of the game, despite, again, him and Earl being in positions that they shouldn't have been in the majority. And while I do think Earl just simply outplays him, really, because even if him and Yaman were to get to the end, even Yaman admits himself that he would have probably lost at the end. So I think mixing that in with the fact that I think he's a very high variance player, as we saw in Survivor Micronesia where he was taken out right away, I think on most given seasons, he's either going to be a very, very early boot or he's going to make it towards the end. And that level of variance is too large, in my opinion, to really allow him to be in the top 10. I did consider Coach, and I think this is the thing with Coach, is that while I think he played one of the most dominant games in the history of Survivor, I think his game in South Pacific is one of the best non-winning games ever. I think him as a player overall, I feel like that's his 100% best case scenario. I feel like he's someone that very rarely wins the game of Survivor. I think that was really his one shot to win Survivor, and he messed it up for himself by not admitting to the jury the type of game that he was playing. I think he actively messed it up for himself there. And I feel like that's probably what he does the majority of the time on Survivor. He's another one that I don't think is ever really an early boot, but I think he has a very tough road to get to the end and have the respect from the jury to win the game. So because of that, he didn't make the list for me. I did also consider Russell Hantz, and this is the thing about Russell Hantz, is that he is a master at getting to the end of the game with a group of people that don't know who he is. We saw him do it twice in a row. I mean, we saw him do it in Samoa. We saw him do it in Heroes vs. Villains. He knows how to get to the end. And then the 2 times he played Survivor after that, he wasn't able to do that. But again, people knew who he was. On Redemption On, he had no shot in Redemption On. There was no way any group of people were going to allow him to get anywhere close to the end of that season, even though I do think he misplays that season as well. And then on Australian Survivor, I think he plays that even worse, where he finds an idol and doesn't utilize it, even though he knew that he was one of the targets out there. But again, like we saw on the 2 seasons that no one knew who he was, he did extremely well. I mean, his game in Samoa is an extremely dominant game. And I see a lot of people claim that like his jury management was so terrible in Samoa. I don't necessarily really agree with that, because if we see people's final confessionals as they leave the game, they all talk about how Russell is playing the best game. Like even Dave Ball, someone who doesn't end up voting for him, was super complimentary of Russell on the way out. I do think he has poor jury management during the Monica vote. I don't think he handles that situation particularly great, and I don't think he handles the Brett situation great. But I truly do look at his Samoa game as one of the best like non-winning games of Survivor. And then to see him do the exact same thing on the next season, I think it really shows how repeatable his gameplay style is with a new group of people. However, I think on that season, though, his jury management was even worse. I mean, the fact that, again, he calls Rupert a dumbass, like, right in front of his face is just dumb. I mean, he does a lot of poor jury management of, like, Danielle and later on Jerry. It's like, I don't think he plays the end game of that season well at all, but he's still able to get to the end. I mean, I do think he is an impressive player of Survivor. Like, no matter how you look at it, I think what he did was impressive. Now, is it a winning game of Survivor? No, because he didn't win, and I don't think his style of gameplay is really one that does win a good chunk of times, and that's why he's not on this list. But I do think Russell is probably a better player than people really give him credit for. I also considered Andrea, as I feel like Andrea is one of the most consistent players in Survivor. I feel like she's someone that almost never goes out pre-merge. I feel like she's someone that does very well in the early merge, probably controls some votes, wins immunities, but I feel like she's always going to be a target mid-merge, and we've seen this literally all 3 times she's played the game. And while that's good in the grand scheme of things, I mean, if we're looking at like every single player that's ever played Survivor, she's definitely well above average, but when we're doing this top 10 non-winning player list, I think she barely misses the cut there. I did consider Ciara Easton on the list because I do think Ciara has a pretty good strategic mind for the game. I think she's at points able to get people to do what she wants. She knows her optimal path to the end of the game. I do think she has some fundamental flaws in her game, though. I think she's always going to be a target right off the bat. I think she's someone that's always going to be looked at as like a physical weakness, but also someone that's strategically savvy enough that you need to get her out early. And I do think she overplays at points. So for me, again, Ciara didn't really make the cut. And the last honorable mention I wanted to mention here was Ty Trang. And Ty is someone that I think definitely lacks something strategically in the game, and that's one of the reasons why he didn't make it onto the list, because I do feel like it's hard to see Ty make a move that's really optimal for his game. I mean, if we look at Go Wrong, I think that season was filled with a bevy of decisions from him that were really baffling. Like, I think him flipping against Scott Pollard was completely against his best interest at that point in the game. I think him keeping Aubrey at the Final Four was, again, very much against his best interest in the game at that point. But he's another one of the most consistent players in Survivor. I don't see Ty going home anytime pre-merge on any season. I think he's very good at endearing himself to a lot of the players, and I feel like through that, he's always able to get to around the mid-merge section of the game. I think from that point, considering the fact that he always has idols and he can win challenges, I do feel like there's a good chance that he can make it to the end of the game. There's obviously the question of, can he gather enough respect to win a jury vote, and I do think he could have won Game Changers if he was against the right people. I feel like it's tough for me to see him pull off the correct moves that he needs to make to win the game, so for me, he didn't make the cut either. But now on to the actual top 10 list, the top 10 non-winning players of all time. And at number 10, we had someone that was a bit tough. Again, like a lot of these people that I just mentioned were very close with this person for number 10. So at number 10 here, I have Aubrey Bracco. And the tough thing about Aubrey for me is I do look at her as someone that's either going to make it very, very far in the game or someone that's going to be taken out very early. But for me, what put Aubrey above some of the people like a Yaman or a Johnny Fairplay or a Ciara was the fact that we have seen Aubrey make it literally pretty much to the end twice. We've seen her play in dominant game, at least dominant game from like the mid-merge on, and we saw her play a very messy game in Game Changers where she had no clue what was going on, but still was able to make it very far into the game. And despite her Edge of Extinction run being pretty terrible overall, I mean, we did see that she has the ability to find idols. She's always been a decent physical challenger in team competitions. Has a very good strategic mind for the game, always knows where her optimal move is, was very good at emotional manipulation with convincing Ty to flip on Scott Pollard. I think that's a masterclass move, especially because, again, it was completely against Ty's best interest, in my opinion. But as I said, I think she's high variance. I do think she's someone that could have been an early boot on Go Wrong with how she had that breakdown on the first day there. And we saw her get targeted again on Game Changers. Mind you, that time it was more so because of the target on her back, because obviously she just came from playing an extremely dominant game in Go Wrong. And then also in Edge of Extinction, we do see her, again, actually get taken out early. But again, that was also due to, again, a target on her back for being a returning player. But I do think just in general, I do think she's someone that, given any random season, I could see her being targeted earlier on. But she's able to squeak by that. I do think she has a very good chance of making it at least to the end of the game. And I think if she got to the end on Game Changers, I do think she wins a jury vote. I think if she got to the end and Go Wrong against a couple probably different people, I do think she could probably win that. But I do think she completely misplayed the jury on Go Wrong. And I think that's a bit worrying on a player ranking of like really deciding on whether or not she can really win a game of Survivor. But again, I really debated a lot between her and a lot of these honorable mentions. I just felt like Aubrey was the one that has the most proof to the merits of her game, with her getting towards the end in both Go Wrong and Game Changers through completely different methods, while also having a chance to win the game in both of those, and also just having natural game ability throughout that as well. So for me, Aubrey landed here at number 10. Now at number 9, we have the only one-time player on the top 10 here, and at number 9 here we have Dominic Abate. And what is there to say about Dominic Abate? He is the person that's come the closest to winning out of all of the non-winners. I mean, he literally had a tied jury vote at the end, loses due to the tiebreaker of Laurel being the deciding vote and Laurel just having a natural connection to Wendell. Despite from what we've seen on the show, it seemed like Dominic actually put more work into building a bond with Laurel. It seemed like Dominic was the one to pull Laurel into that alliance to begin with. And really, that's my thing about Dominic as a whole, is I feel like Dominic dominated that season strategically. A lot of people say, oh, it was Dominic and Wendell, but from what we were shown on the show, it was almost all Dominic, at least with the strategic maneuvering throughout the game. I mean, from what we see, it is Dominic being the person to manage these relationships that allowed them to make it further into the game. Now, Dominic did have a massive misstep earlier on in the game with him creating that rivalry with Chris Noble right off the bat, and that's not particularly great. But I think once he gets off his initial tribe and once that Morgan vote happens, which again is also not great, from that point forward, I think he plays an extremely dominant game. I mean, pretty much dominates the rest of the game. Where again, along with Wendell, they have pretty much complete control from that point forward. And a lot of the reason why he does lose the game, in my opinion, is because Wendell wins immunities. And Wendell had an idol. And like all these things that made it so that he couldn't get Wendell out when he needed to. And even then, against Wendell, he had 5 locked jury votes and was only 1 vote away from winning the game. Now, obviously, you have to take flaw of him not being able to get that one other vote, but still, I do find his game so impressive. His final 6 move with his fake idol, I think, is another one of the most impressive moves in the history of Survivor, but I think through that, he did come off a bit aggressive to the point where people didn't really respect the move as a game move. They took it personally, and I do think that is a flaw that you have to at least consider here. I do look at Dominic as a great player survivor. I think he had one of the most dominant games we've ever seen, but he had a few crucial flaws that made it so he didn't win the game. And also, we've only seen him play once. I feel like I don't have enough information to truly rank him above the 8 players we're going to be talking about after this that have played multiple times. I have a better idea of how they played the game. So for me, as much as I respect Dominic's game as a whole, I feel like it's tough to put him above the other 8. So for me, he lands here at number 9. Or number 8. At number 8 here, we have someone that I have a lot of respect for, and someone that at the time played the most fluid game we had ever seen, and that is Rob Cesternino. And Rob, I mean, again, we saw him in Amazon being able to flip back and forth between alliances and being able to squeak his way all the way to the final 3. He does start the game kind of on the bottom of the majority alliance, but still able to make his way to the swap. And from the swap on, I think he has a lot of agency within the game. He's able to get into a new majority with Jenna and Dina that allows him to become one of the more central figures within the game. At the merge, that alliance is able to stay strong and take out Roger and Dave, and he does lose his ally in Dina, which is something he didn't want to happen. But from the final 7 on, he plays a very fluid game where he flips on his majority alliance to take out Alex, then him and Matthew flip back over to take out Christy when she becomes untrustworthy, which, I mean, again, it's impressive that he's able to maneuver around the game, but to be honest, I do look at that as a flaw in his game. I do think that was actually not a great move for him. But then after that, he flips back and votes out Heidi. Then Jenna wins out, and he's essentially screwed over by that. But if Jenna didn't win out, Rob more than likely wins that season. And even if Jenna had taken him to the end, I do think there's a very good chance he wins a jury vote. Mind you, it's going to be 4-3, and really it comes down to Christy, which is not a great spot to be in. But I would think that Rob wins that jury vote, but again, who really knows? But for me, there's a couple issues with Rob. I think, one, I always see him having trouble earlier on in the game. I think early on in the game, he's the type of person that's never in control of his initial tribe. I think he's someone that's always going to be like at the bottom of their alliance on the initial tribe. And through that, that could put him in a precarious spot. Obviously on All-Stars, he was taken out early, but again, I mean, that was mostly due to his reputation. But even then, I mean, he did seem to get on some people's nerves on that season. So I don't think that's particularly great. And also, I just don't know how well, again, as I said with a lot of these old school players, I just don't know how well he adapts to the modern game. Again, he's not someone that I really have that much issue with him not being able to keep up with the pace of the modern game or anything. But I just feel like, as we saw from the RJP Sequester game that he was on, it did seem like he was a bit too passive in that game. I don't think he was as aggressive as he needed to be to position himself into a position that could have made it to the end. I think he allowed people to make moves that were just against their best interest. And for all those things, I just feel like Rob, as much as I love his initial game, I love him as a character, I love him as a podcaster, I just feel like it's tough to really put him that much higher than here at number 8. Now number 7, and at number 7 we actually have Rob's know-it-all's partner there, and we have Stephen Fishback. And this was a debate for me on which one is the better player between the two. I do think Rob is a more fluid player, but I feel like Stephen has shown that he's probably the better player. I mean, we saw on Token Chains that him and JT pretty much dominated that entire season. And through that, he was able to build really strong bonds with people, mind you, not as strong of bonds as JT was able to build. And I think that's something that you have to knock him a bit for. But still, I think if he was against anyone but JT, I think Stephen probably wins a jury vote on that season. And then we look at Cambodia, where he does start off very rocky, which is, again, one of my issues with him as a player as a whole, is I do think he comes off as a bit schemy earlier on in the game. I think if he isn't able to build those initial bonds right away, I do think there's a very good chance that he is a early target, but he was able to recover from that and build a really strong bond with Jeremy and Tasha and Kimmy Kappenberg, and through these people he was able to make it all the way to the final 10. And at the final 10 he does get saved by Jeremy's idol, but again, you have to give him credit for building a strong enough bond with Jeremy to where Jeremy was willing to play an idol for him. And he does eventually get sniped out at final 9 due to a plurality vote where he ends up splitting the votes and using his vote steal incorrectly and all this crazy stuff. But in my opinion, Steven is a great player Survivor. I think he has one of the best strategic minds for the game of Survivor, and whenever I listen to the Survivor know-it-alls, I always tend to agree with Steven's side of the argument than Rob's. And I feel like Steven just has a much more grounded grasp on the game of Survivor. And with him having shown more of an ability to dominate a game of Survivor, that is what puts him above Rob for me. So really, these two players are extremely close. Now we're number 6. We kind of have someone that I can also lump in with the Steven and Robs of the bunch, as they're kind of in their own tier on this list. And for me at number 6, we have David Wright. David Wright, I think, played one of the best Fallen Angel games in the history of Survivor. Now, if you don't know what Fallen Angel is, it's the person that gets taken out right before the final tribal council. And I will eventually be doing a ranking of all the Fallen Angels at some point. But spoiler alert for that video, David Wright is going to be very high on that. I think David Wright played a really impressive game. I mean, with the fact of how much control he was able to have at portions of that game and somehow not be sniped out until the final 4, despite so many people coming after him. He was able to keep that main core group really loyal to him for a good chunk of time. I mean, he obviously had Ken and Hannah really close to him and was able to have Adam at points, and they really just ran the game despite losing out on a rock draw. I was actually impressed to see him play as well as he did on Edge of Extinction as well. I mean, he does have his flaws, obviously, but on Edge of Extinction, I was surprised that he wasn't an initial target. I mean, it seemed like no one really talked about getting rid of David earlier on in the game. I mean, all the eyes were on Kelly Wentworth. I do think straight up War Dog outplays him the entire way through, but even on that season, I think he played to the best of his ability considering the circumstance that he was given. To be honest, I think that season really boosted him up on the rankings here. I think if it was before that season, I think he would have been below Steven and Rob and probably Dominic. He would probably be around where Aubrey is. But I do think after Edge of Extinction, I think it really showed that he's able to maneuver his way through really bad scenarios. And while I do think he has a very good chance of being an early boot on a good chunk of the seasons that he ends up playing. I mean, even on Millennials vs. Gen X, he was someone that was looked at as pretty sketchy earlier on. But even then, like, he was never actually targeted at any point. So I think the fact that he's able to maneuver around really bad scenarios, adding in the fact that he can also dominate the game at points, and is also very good at finding idols. Overall, I just look at him as a much more fluid and dynamic player than Steven or Rob, and I think of him as a better version of those two players, really. So for me, David Wright lands here at number 6. Now at number 5. At number 5, we have someone I literally just mentioned not too long ago. That's Kelly Wentworth. And Kelly was a tough one to really rank because despite how legendary of a figure she is now within the Survivor community, I am always mixed on her actual gameplay within the seasons. I think overall she is a great player of Survivor. I think she's someone that really has it all coming into a season. I think she's very good physically to where she shouldn't be targeted earlier on. I mean, she does get taken out early in San Juan del Sur, but a lot of that's due to really just a bad tribe swap for her and her being paired up with her dad. And even on Edge, she was targeted, but again, a lot of that was due to her reputation. So I think on any given season, she shouldn't be targeted earlier on. She's someone that's good at finding idols. She's someone that knows the game pretty well. I think she's a very savvy player overall. But I just don't feel like her actual games have really proven this. Again, as I said, on San Juan del Sur, she gets taken out pretty early. Mind you, I mean, she does have a very good position on that initial Hanapu tribe, being part of that core alliance, being tightly aligned with like Natalie and Jeremy. And if the swap had gone better for her, I do think there's a very good chance she could have won that season. But then with Cambodia, I mean, I've said this already in the past. I do not look at her Cambodia game as that impressive. I mean, she spends almost the entire season on the bottom, not really knowing what is going on and having to win challenges or use idols to get her way through the game. While I feel like she showed a lot of game acumen during that season, I feel like her actual gameplay through the season was relatively poor. But I think coming into Edge of Extinction, I do find it very impressive how despite coming in with such a massive target, I was impressed with how well she was able to play. I mean, she was the last of the returning players to be in the game. In a season that the returning players were very much targeted in the game, she was able to build a really strong bond with Lauren and War Dog that really carried her throughout the season. I mean, really, in my opinion, I think her Edge of Extinction game is probably the best game she played. Overall, like, Kelly Wentworth's weird because it's like I do have a lot of flaws within her individual games, but I think the natural game ability is there for her. So despite my flaws with her actual execution throughout the years, I do look at her as a great player Survivor, and she still lands here at number 5. Now number 4, and number 4 here we have another player that's kind of similar to Kelly Wentworth, though I think has probably shown more of his game ability throughout his games than her, and that is Spencer Bledsoe. Now Spencer's Kage-On game is pretty similar to Kelly Wentworth's in my opinion. I think he's someone that was on the bottom for a good chunk of the season and really only makes it as far as he does due to the saving grace of Tony Velachos flipping on his alliance every other round, and also due to him having an idol or winning challenges. And I really feel like that game, despite him, if he got to the end of the game, he wins in a landslide. I think that was an extremely sloppy and really a poorly played game by Spencer. And then we get to Second Chance, and it starts off relatively similarly to that. I mean, despite him controlling that first vote, he easily loses control right away. The second vote ends up being on the bottom after a tribe swap, which isn't particularly great. But I think he's put into a decent position coming to the merge. He's able to orchestrate Stephen Fishback blindside, which, I mean, I don't know if that's really a great move for him, considering I do think Stephen was more loyal to him than what he realized. But I think he plays the endgame pretty well. I mean, pretty much everything that he wanted to happen happened. I think the biggest issue for him is that what he wanted to happen didn't lead to a win. I think the biggest issue with Spencer is that I think he took Jeremy and Wentworth way too far. I think he needed to get to the end with either Abby or someone like maybe even a Keith he could have possibly won against. But I do think there are scenarios where Spencer wins that season, but I just feel like he needed to be up against completely different competition. But even then, I think getting to the end on that season, despite the massive target that was on his back, is still very impressive. And he was the one to convince Jeremy to switch up the vote at Final 6, where Jeremy, for some reason, was believing Kimmy, and Spencer had to convince him not to, and obviously that turned out to be the correct move. So, I mean, I think Spencer definitely has a lot of game ability within the game. I mean, I think he knows how to execute his plans. It's just I think he sometimes has a misread on the actual scenarios within the game. But I think he's also someone that's able to find idols. He's able to win challenges. I mean, I think he's just a pretty solid all-around player, where he's good at all three aspects of the game. I mean, social's probably not as great, but it's like I do feel like he has the ability to make relationships with people, especially because he tried a lot harder in Cambodia to do that. But he does have a bevy of flaws within his games themselves, which kind of lands him in the same tier as Kelly Wentworth, so he lands here at number 4. Now at number 3, we have another person that's in that similar sort of tier, but someone that, again, I was very close between her and Spencer. I decided to go with her at number 3. And at number 3 here, we have Amanda. I don't know, to be honest, number 3 seems a bit high for me when I think of Amanda's game. I mean, I do think her China game is pretty strong overall, but I was never really that big of a fan of her Micronesia game, and I think Heroes vs. Villains is just kind of all over the place. So really, 3 seems a bit high, but really looking at every other person that was eligible for this list, I mean, I guess it fits. I mean, I guess she is number 3, because I do think she is another one of the most consistent players in History Survivor. I mean, kind of like the Andrea, where I think no matter what, she's going to make it to the merge every single season. I think she's going to make a deep run every single season. But unlike Andrea, who hasn't made it past that like mid-game threshold, we've seen Amanda make it to the end twice. Like, she's literally got a 3rd and 2nd place finish under her belt. And then after that, she also has a 9th place finish under her belt in a situation where if her alliance had been able to make it through that round, taking out the opposition, they more than likely run the game, and Amanda more than likely wins that game in that situation. But in Survivor China, I mean, her and Todd, like, they dominate the game. I mean, they have pretty much complete control from beginning to end. And a lot of the reason why she does end up losing at the end is because she is a bit more passive than Todd, and also just her jury performance was really terrible. She comes back from Micronesia right away and is able to make it to the end again, despite, again, playing a slightly different game. Again, in China, she was completely dominant for the entire way through. In Micronesia, she had a lot more rocky roads there. I mean, she was always in the majority alliance. Even at the time of the Ozzy boot, supposedly she knew that was going to happen. And according to Ozzy himself, he says that Amanda was the one that orchestrated that, which I don't know if I fully believe that. Though it has been said multiple times that Amanda did know that Ozzy was going to be booted there. But from that point on, I mean, she's in the Black Widow Brigade. She's part of that alliance that is able to steamroll the game. She does play the idol successfully for herself at the final 6. But I just feel like throughout that season, she has a lot less control than what she did the first time around. But again, it's still an impressive game nonetheless, especially with her doing it 2 times in a row. And it's not like she had no chance of winning the game on either of these seasons. I think in both of these seasons, there were scenarios where she wins the game. I think if she had been a bit more active and just better at talking to the jury on Tyonna, I think there's a good chance she wins the game. Or even if she's up against different competition, I think she wins the game. In Micronesia, I mean, there was a chance that she would have gotten Eliza's vote, and who knows what happens at that point. And even then, if she's up against different people, I think there's a chance that she wins the game as well. I mean, she's up against like a Natalie or an Alexis. So for me, that's why she's on this list when like Russell isn't. Because I feel like Russell, no matter what he did, I think he loses Heroes versus Villains. And even then, I think he had a much rockier road to getting to the end on Samoa than Amanda did on like Tyonna. So I do look at Amanda as a much better player than Russell. And even on her Heroes vs. Villains game, I do think she plays a solid game during that season as well. I do think she makes a few missteps. I think her not trusting JT led to her allowing JT to give the idol to Russell, which I think isn't particularly great. I also think her lying abilities are still pretty poor, with her lying to Parvati and Parvati just instantly knowing that she's lying to her. I don't think that's great either. I mean, like, I think Amanda still has a bevy of flaws within her game, at least at the last time that we saw her within Heroes versus Villains. But I think she was much better positioned in that game to win the game if she had gotten to the end. I think, again, at that final 9 vote, if Candace had not flipped on the heroes, Sandra ends up flipping. And through that, the heroes have control after that. Where unless there's like idle shenanigans going on and Amanda gets sniped out of the game, more than likely the final 3 is going to end up being Amanda, Colby, and Rupert. And Amanda more than likely wins that season. So really, I don't think she's had a poor game out of her 3 games. And that's something that's very impressive to see. So for me, she lands here at number 3. Now we're number 2, and number 2, again, these top 2 were the clear number 1 and 2 for me. I mean, to be honest, there's a clear number 1, so I mean, you should know who that is at this point. But at number 2 here, the second best non-winning player of all time for me is Malcolm Freeberg. And the thing about Malcolm is I just feel like he's such a versatile player. I mean, we saw him on Philippines play from a very bad position of his tribe losing all the challenges on Mat Singh. He's able to integrate himself within Tandang and then come into the merge. Despite those few votes being a bit rocky, I mean, he has a good sense of what's going on in the game at that point. And from the final 9 on, he pretty much dominates the game until the point that Lisa decides to flip on Mat 4. And really, obviously, that causes the end of his game. And I do think he makes an active mistake in letting Denise go there and let Denise pretty much turn against him, and that's not great. But I think just the sheer game ability that he displayed within that season is very impressive. And then on Caramoan, we saw him play a completely different type of game where he's on the bottom pretty much the entire way through. And again, while he makes a lot of mistakes in that position, I do think it's impressive the amount of idols that he was able to find. And he has that 3 Amigos trial, which I do think he misplays, but he was still able to concoct the idea of pulling out these idols and trying not to use them, though obviously that doesn't end up working out. I think his move at the final 11 where he gets Reynolds to play an idol on him is just incredible. I mean, when Reynolds literally gets up to play the idol on himself and Malcolm's just able to convince him to toss the idol to him, it's just insane. I think through those 2 seasons, he's really shown a massive amount of game ability to play the game from different types of positions. And on Game Changers, I mean, he starts off the game very strong as well, where despite coming in as this big, massive threat, he's not targeted by his initial group. And he was initially on board with keeping all the threats around, though that doesn't end up turning out because obviously Tony and Sandra end up targeting each other. But I mean, he really gets screwed over by that double tribal, by that joint tribal where he ends up getting idled out as well, mind you, to be taken out there by the opposing tribe who had never met him. I mean, that was really just one of the biggest screw-overs for a player in the history of Survivor, possibly. But again, I mean, I mentioned this when I talked about Ozzy, but I feel like he's essentially Ozzy, but with game ability. Like, he's Ozzy that knows how to play the game. I think he's shown that he has the ability to dominate a game of Survivor. And through his decent enough ability in challenges and his ability to find idols, I do think on certain seasons he's able to ride his way all the way to the end. I think also the fire making challenge being available now also greatly benefits him. And I feel like he's the type of person that will never lose a jury vote. I mean, unlike Amanda, who we've seen make it to the end twice and lose both times, I feel like Malcolm's the type of person that if he gets to the end on any season, he wins that season no matter what. And for me, that was enough to land him here at number 2. Now at number 1, the number 1 non-winning player of all time for Survivor. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, it was the only player that could qualify from this list that was on my top 10 players of all time list. I mean, it has to be Ciara. Now, I mean, I've even said this in the past. I think Ciara's games are a little bit overrated. I do think certain elements of her games are overstated by a lot of people, but I mean, Ciara is clearly number 1 on this list. I think Ciara has one of the best strategic minds in the history of Survivor. I mean, not saying she's without flaws, because I do think she certainly is. I do think her Panama game as a whole is pretty overrated. Because, I mean, if we look at Panama, I don't think there's a chance she wins the game unless she goes to the end with Danielle. And she actively didn't want to go to the end with Danielle. She was trying to go to the end with Aris. So I think that is a flaw in her game. And a lot of people like to say, oh, she only lost because of the fire making challenge. But it's like, no, she was going to lose anyway. But again, I think her positioning within that game was very impressive, though. The way that she was able to pull off the 3-2-1, the way she was able to survive those early few rounds, despite her being looked at as the weak member of the tribe. I do think all that is very impressive. We saw her in Micronesia play an extremely dominant game that season. And really, if the game had played out like it should have, I think she wins. I mean, if it had been a final 3, which it was going to be until James got medevaced from the game, Ciara wins that game. I mean, if it's Ciara, Parvati, Amanda, final 3, and we look at the votes, I mean, it is going to be a 3-2-2 vote no matter what. It's just a matter of who that third vote goes on to, with that third vote essentially being Alexis. I mean, that's the main question mark in the bunch. And, I mean, Alexis has said in her Ponderosa video and also after the season that she would have voted for Ciara. So despite the show itself showing her being closer to Parvati, I feel like there's no real doubt that she does vote for Ciara. So really, that was her game to lose. I mean, she is essentially a winner despite her losing that season. And then here's her villains. Obviously, she was a massive target coming into that. She obviously gets taken out early. I mean, that wasn't too surprising. But then game changers again. I mean, she makes it very deep into the game, and she had a chance to win the game. I mean, she goes against anyone on game changers. I do think she wins that season. Now, I do think people overstate how much she gets screwed over by Advantage again. I mean, obviously she got screwed over in the sense that she goes home by default. But if we look at how the game would have played out, I mean, I don't see Ciara getting to the end anyway. I think people knew Ciara was such a massive target, and I do think she would have been sniped out before the end anyway. And also, if we have just knowing that Brad Culpepper wins out anyway, I do think Ty and Aubrey flip on Ciara no matter what. So, I mean, I don't see Ciara actually winning that season, despite what a lot of people say. But the fact that she was able to get into the position to almost win that season and does get screwed over by Advantage again is something that I do think you have to give some merit to. While I do have faults with Ciara's early game, again, I do think if coming into any given season, I do think there's a chance she gets booted early. I mean, she was a big target on her initial season. She gets through Micronesia pretty fine, actually. But then on Heroes vs. Villains, she is an early boot. And on Game Changers, she would have been the first boot had her tribal gone the tribal initially. But if she's able to get past that, I do think she's always going to play a very impressive game. So because of that, for me, Ciara lands here at number 1. So there we go. Those are my top 10 non-winning players in the history of Survivor. After this, I will be doing a top 10 non-winning one-time player list, and that will be followed up with a top 10 one-time player list. Those should be fun, and I mean, all these lists have very different people on them, so it should be fun to go through those. But for now, that's the video. That's my top 10 non-winning players of Survivor US. Thank you for watching.